All right. Yep, it's recording. Okay. So just to tell you, basically, my answer to all the questions in the discussion is going to be that I've got a much better answer in my book, which you need to read. So I'm going to start with a bleak thought experiment, which I call the ending world. Scientists are agreed on the following grim facts. A distant cataclysmic event has produced deadly cosmic rays that are spreading through the galaxy. When these cosmic rays pass through our solar system, 200 years from now, all life on Earth will be extinguished. So it's part of the story that we cannot prevent this from happening, nor can we hope to outrun the cosmic rays. Humanity thus faces an extinction that is unavoidable and imminent, but not immediate. So I've just finished writing a book that explores philosophy within this slowly ending world. In today's talk, I have two goals. The first is to persuade you that my thought experiment is interesting, and that's the main one, really. And then the second thing is I want to sketch the main lessons, or some of the main lessons that I draw from this thought experiment. So my slowly ending world thought experiment raises two immediate questions. The first is, why talk about unavoidable extinction? And the second is, why talk about imminent extinction rather than immediate extinction? So why add the 200-year delay? A growing philosophical literature asks how we should think about risks of human extinction. And especially, it asks how much we should sacrifice to reduce those risks. This literature presumes that we want to avoid extinction, and then it asks how we can avoid it. I've contributed to that literature myself just a little bit. In an earlier cosmic rays thought experiment, I included a realistic possibility of escape via generation starships at a very high present cost. So in that scenario, humanity faces a choice between imminent extinction and escape to the stars. I still think that these existential risk choices are important, but I also think that to properly understand the values at stake in such choices, we should first think more carefully about exactly why extinction would be bad. If humanity really did have only 2 centuries to live, what might those centuries be like? And why would it matter now that the end is coming soon? So I therefore remove the escape option entirely and stipulate unavoidable extinction to focus our attention on that, even though this assumption is no doubt very artificial. So that's why I think about unavoidable extinction. Unavoidable immediate human extinction is already on the philosophical agenda. In 2 recent books, Samuel Scheffler explores a doomsday scenario where I know that the world will be destroyed 30 days after my death, and an infertility scenario where everyone on Earth becomes infertile and the present generation know that they will be the last. So why talk about a slowly ending world? What does my 200-year delay add to Scheffler's original immediate extinction scenarios? I want to argue that my slowly ending world has 5 distinctive and interesting features. Clarity about intuitions, imagining a future that people might inhabit, introducing an intergenerational perspective, confronting the inevitability of extinction, and drawing connections with other possible futures. So the first point is that the slowly ending world adds clarity. Immediate extinction confuses our intuitions because it's bad in too many, too obvious ways. Scheffler highlights the significance for us of our implicit assumption that there will be some future generations, some future people whose culture, traditions, values, and projects are connected to and descended from our own. It's not hard to see why the denial of this assumption, the removal of any cultural descendants at all, might be very destabilizing in lots of ways. By contrast, in my slowly ending world, the disruption to our present projects is much less direct. After all, 200 years is a long time. How many of our present activities will leave any discernible trace in 2 centuries' time? We don't think about distant future people as we go about our daily lives. So why should their absence matter to us? But it seems that it would matter, or at least that's how it seems to me. Something of vital importance, something that matters, is lost even at the start of the slowly ending world. Even the loss of the more distant human future would still be very destabilizing. So then the philosophical challenge is to explain why. A second distinctive feature is that unlike Scheffler's unrealistic scenarios, my slowly ending world is a credible human future. It's a place where future people might live. Something like this might happen at some time in the not too distant future. A third and related feature is that unlike Scheffler's single generation scenarios, my thought experiment is intergenerational. If we imagine ourselves living at the start of my slowly ending world, when human history has potentially another 200 years to go, then we reintroduce procreative ethics, intergenerational justice, and obligations to future people. So we are now imagining a world where present people owe things to future people. Namely, they owe things to the people who will live closer to humanity's end, and especially to those living in the last human generation. We must then ask whether it is even permissible to create these new generations who will live even closer to humanity's inevitable end. A fourth distinctive feature is that while it may seem bizarre and implausible, there is a sense in which my scenario is actually inevitable. Humanity will end. Someone will inhabit an ending world. As Mark Johnston pointed out in a review of Scheffler's book, Death and the Afterlife, there is something odd about arguing from the premise that it's undesirable to belong to the last human generation to the conclusion that we ought to continue the human story. The reason why that's odd is because human extinction cannot be avoided. It can only be postponed. We cannot remove the burden of belonging to the last generation. We can only avoid that burden for ourselves by passing it down the line to some unspecified future generation. Johnston likens this intergenerational buck passing to continuing a Ponzi scheme, where those who've got in early benefit at the expense of those who come later. Because we assume that humanity enjoys an indefinite future, we easily forget the inevitability of extinction. We thus ignore the plight of the last generation. By contrast, in my slowly ending world, where present people can only pass the burden a few generations down the line, where the last human generation would be at most our near descendants, in that world, the Ponzi challenge cannot be ignored. A final distinctive feature is that my slowly ending world has interesting parallels with two other very different possible futures. On the one hand, the ending world resembles a broken future, a world that I've talked about elsewhere. This is a place where a chaotic climate makes life precarious, where each generation is worse off than the last, where it is no longer possible to meet everyone's basic needs, and where our affluent way of life is no longer an option. Scheffler argues that the loss of an indefinite human future itself makes future people worse off. Without an indefinite human future, people lose faith in their existing values, which in turn disrupts social and economic arrangements, leading to further reductions in well-being and security. On the other hand, the ending world might instead be a post-scarcity paradise. Freed from the need to worry about the more distant future, the last human generation might enjoy morally unproblematic affluence. Consider how many of our present-day crises would just disappear if there were no long-term future. Presumably, it is okay to squander resources as if there were no tomorrow, if there really is no tomorrow. If we devote our energies to making future people's lives as good as possible, then they might be better off than we are rather than worse off. I think one reason the ending world is particularly ethically interesting is because whether it's a good future or a bad one, whether it's a broken world or a post-scarcity paradise, depends largely on how its inhabitants react to it, on whether or not they find it sufficiently meaningful. In other possible broken futures, it's an objective fact that resources are scarce relative to basic human needs. A future broken by climate change is bad, no matter what anyone thinks about it. By contrast, the badness or goodness of imminent human extinction is primarily a matter of how people react to it. Living at the start of a slowly ending world is very bad if people think it's bad, but if people think it's good, then it could be very good indeed. So in all these ways, my slowly ending world adds something new to philosophical debate about human extinction. The rest of my talk today explores some of the main themes of my book. So I've written the book from the perspective of imaginary future philosophers who live at the start of a slowly ending world and seek to adapt our existing philosophies to their new situation. I'll begin with 3 challenges that people living at the start of my slowly ending world will face. These are a pessimist challenge, an antinatalist challenge, and a utopian challenge. The first challenge comes from a new form of pessimism that is distinctive to my slowly ending world. Philosophical pessimists argue that life is either meaningless or not worth living. My ending world pessimists focus on the loss of meaning caused by human extinction. They argue that even if life can be meaningful for people who enjoy an indefinite human future, the loss of that future is enough to make life meaningless. In the book, I explore several different arguments for ending world pessimism, drawn from various philosophical traditions. One of those arguments draws on Scheffler's own argument that even our most apparently self-contained and present-focused projects still presuppose an ongoing background of traditions, values, or relationships that extend into the future. So let's start with Scheffler's immediate extinction scenarios. Following Scheffler, my ending world pessimist argues that in those original stories, 2 things are lost. The most obvious loss is that future-directed projects are no longer available. If the world is about to end, then I cannot find meaning by laying the foundation stone for a structure that future people will build, or playing a founding role in a long-term project to find a cure for cancer, or whatever. The less obvious loss is that although our existing non-future directed projects would still be available, those projects are no longer meaningful in all the ways that they used to be, because their meaning was grounded in some broader story about human traditions and values that we inherit from the past and pass down to the future. We can still listen to music, enjoy a beautiful sunset, and be compassionate to others, but these present-focused activities no longer make sense in all the ways that they used to. So consider an analogy. Suppose I am a firm believer in God. If I then lose my faith in God, I will suffer two distinct kinds of loss. The more obvious loss is that my existing God-directed projects are no longer available. I cannot find meaning by worshipping God if I no longer think that God exists. The less obvious loss is that while my existing projects that are not directed towards God are still available, those projects no longer have the same meaning as before. Because the thought is, their meaning for me as a theist was grounded in some broader story about my relationship to God. For instance, while I can still care for others, I can no longer understand this caring as part of God's plan for my life, or as an appropriate response to my recognition that other people are valuable because they are created in the image of God. So in both cases, the loss of the future or the loss of God, what is philosophically more interesting is the broader loss of future-dependent or God-dependent meaning, and not the loss of particular projects. So Scheffler's central point is that the loss of future-directed meaning is broader than the loss of future-directed projects. In Scheffler's original immediate extinction scenarios, the loss of all future-dependent meaning makes life meaningless for the last generation. That's what the pessimist argues. My ending world pessimist extends this critique from Scheffler, arguing that future-dependent meaning is lost even earlier because our current values require an indefinite human future. So future-dependent meaning is lost even at the start of my slowly ending world. So the first challenge for philosophers living in my ending world is to rebut ending world pessimism. Their second challenge comes from a new kind of antinatalism that is also distinctive to my slowly ending world. In this philosophical sense, an antinatalist is someone who argues that procreation is impermissible. The distinctively ending world antinatalist argues that while procreation might be permissible in a world that enjoyed an indefinite future, the prospect of imminent extinction is itself sufficient to make procreation impermissible. My slowly ending world differs from Scheffler's immediate extinction scenarios because it's intergenerational. The first generation is not the last. Present people are followed by future people. But this intergenerational dimension presumes that it's permissible for present people to create those future people, and in particular that it's permissible for the penultimate generation to create a last generation who cannot themselves create any further people at all. My ending world antinatalist replies that this is not permissible. People living at the start of the slowly ending world are morally obliged to embrace immediate extinction. If this is true, if the antinatalist is correct, if it's not permissible to create new people in an ending world, then this would collapse the distinction between my slowly ending world and Scheffler's immediate extinction scenarios. because the present generation would have no morally permissible way to avoid being also the last generation. Faced with imminent extinction, they would have to embrace immediate extinction. There's a connection between antinatalism and pessimism. Many antinatalists are also pessimists. They think it's wrong to have children because life is meaningless or life is not worth living. But antinatalism does not require pessimism. Even if we reject pessimism, even if life can be meaningful, we cannot automatically assume that procreation is permissible. This is because most of the principles of procreative permissibility that philosophers have defended set a higher standard than the mere avoidance of a meaningless life. You cannot permissibly create someone whose life is barely worth living or minimally meaningful. So pessimism might be false, but antinatalism might still be true. My first challenge, the ending world pessimist challenge, extended a similar challenge that already arises in Scheffler's original immediate extinction scenarios. By contrast, my antinatalist challenge only arises in a slowly ending world where there could be future people. This is important because, as we've just seen, the antinatalist challenge is much harder to meet than the pessimist challenge. Indeed, in my book, I argue that procreation is only permissible in my slowly ending world when two demanding conditions are met. The first condition is that we must remove the harm of lost future dependent meaning altogether. The second condition is that we must also ensure that the last generation are no worse off than previous generations. If we accept conditions like those, then the antinatalist challenge becomes very difficult to meet. Philosophers in my slowly ending world also face a third challenge, the challenge of reimagining utopian hope. Political philosophy imagines ideal future societies to motivate present sacrifices and to guide present political decisions. But existing utopias involve an ongoing society with an indefinite future. What role can utopia play at humanity's end? Can we replace our inherited visions of an enduring just society with a new vision based on bringing the human story to a suitable end? Like the antinatalist challenge, this utopian challenge is particular to my slowly ending world because utopian thinking is often directed towards the future. I'll return to that connection between utopianism and the future in the last part of my lecture. So how can we solve these three challenges, the pessimist challenge, the antinatalist challenge, and the utopian challenge? One solution to all three challenges would just be to deny that the future matters at all. Human beings can always find sufficient meaning in the present. I call this view presentism. Presentists find meaning in present-focused activities, in pleasures or achievements or compassion for the suffering of others. Presentists argue that these present-focused activities are sufficient for meaning without any connection to anything beyond the human present. Human extinction may be upsetting and dislocating, but it is not a threat to the meaningfulness of human lives. The loss of the indefinite human future may render life slightly less meaningful for some people. And the loss of all future people would certainly derail many particular future-directed projects. But the presentist argues that life can still be meaningful in a slowly ending world and even in the last generation. I think presentism works better for some challenges than for others. In particular, while presentism is a credible response to the pessimist challenge, I don't think it's a credible response to the antinatalist challenge. So even in Scheffler's original immediate extinction scenarios, presentism may well be a credible reply to pessimism. For instance, in their original commentaries on Scheffler's book Death and the Afterlife, Harry Frankfurt and Susan Wolfe defend versions of presentism based on pleasure and compassion. They argue that life remains meaningful and that many things remain worth doing, even if we face immediate extinction. Perhaps Frankfurt and Wolfe are correct. Perhaps present-focused activities can provide meaningful lives, even if the world is about to end. And if present-focused activities are sufficient for a meaningful life, even when extinction is immediate, then they are probably also sufficient at the start of my slowly ending world, when extinction is still some way off. So if presentism is a credible reply in Scheffler's scenario, then it's probably also a credible reply to my ending world pessimist challenge. So that might be true, and I'm prepared to grant it for the sake of argument, at least for today. But unfortunately, that's not enough. Presentism can't rest with just meeting the pessimist challenge, because it cannot so easily defeat my antinatalist challenge. The loss of the human future might not render life meaningless, but it would deprive us of one very important kind of meaning. And the closer we get to humanity's end, the more significant that loss will be. The acid test comes in the last generation. If they cannot enjoy fully meaningful lives, then the penultimate generation face a stark choice: accept a loss of meaning for themselves or impose that same loss on their own children. But then every earlier generation faces an now and pushing it further down the line. But that seems very unsatisfactory. Surely we cannot make our own lives more meaningful by imposing a significant loss of meaning on our own descendants. So we've reached a somewhat counterintuitive situation. I'm arguing that present-focused activities are sufficient in Scheffler's original immediate extinction scenarios, but they're not sufficient in my less extreme, slowly ending world. This is because by introducing the possibility of future people, my thought experiment also introduces the antinatalist challenge. If we are definitely the last generation, as in Scheffler's scenarios, then our only task is to make our own lives meaningful enough. Our only challenge comes from pessimism. By contrast, if there could be future people, as in my slowly ending world, then we must also ask if we can make life more meaningful by cooperating with those future people. But then we must also address the antinatalist challenge. We must justify creating new people in the first place, rather than bringing the human story to an end now. And that new antinatalist challenge raises the bar. So I don't think the presentist solution is going to work. My own solution to all three challenges is a view that I develop over several chapters in the book. It's a view that I call multi-generationalism. It seeks to meet Scheffler-inspired ending world pessimism and ending world antinatalism on their own terms. And then it offers a new utopian vision that embraces imminent extinction. In developing my multi-generationalist solution, I begin with two concessions to ending world pessimism. The first concession is that we do currently find meaning in the indefinite human future. For us, fully meaningful lives require something beyond the human present. The second concession is that everyone needs some sources of meaning that transcend the present generation. Everyone needs some intergenerational sources of meaning. Having made these two concessions, I then introduce a new idea to help me rebut ending world pessimism. This is the idea of an intergenerational reorientation of inherited traditions and values. So I argue that our future-dependent traditions could be reoriented to provide meaning to future people without an indefinite human future, and even to provide meaning in the last generation when no human future remains. This possibility of reorientation is the key to meeting the pessimist and antinatalist challenges. Unfortunately, I don't think this reorientation could occur overnight or within a single generation or within the present generation. So I don't think it's available in Scheffler's immediate extinction scenarios. Present people on their own cannot simply imagine new kinds of meaning that transcend the present generation without needing future generations. However, I do think the necessary reorientation could occur over several generations. Present and future people together might imagine a new kind of meaning that transcends the present generation without depending on the human future. The central claim in my multi-generationalist solution is that if this intergenerational project of reorientation succeeds, then it delivers new reimagined traditions based on the long-term goal of bringing the human story to a good end. And this intergenerational endeavor offers meaning to all generations who participate in it, to the present people who initiate it, to the last generation who complete it, and to everyone in between who carries the project on. So my multi-generationalist solution is thus designed to meet my Scheffler-inspired pessimist challenge on its own terms. I agree with Scheffler that for us, present meaning depends on future descendants who will continue our projects and traditions. If we were the last generation, then our lives would be meaningless, or at least they would not be fully meaningful. The kind of meaning that transcends the present generation is lost in Scheffler's doomsday and infertility scenarios, and that's a serious loss, and there's no time to replace it. However, I then argue that this loss of meaning is a contingent feature of the way we've been raised or acculturated, a feature of the traditions we have inherited, rather than an essential feature of the human condition. We need an indefinite human future to give many of our projects meaning. But other people, including our own descendants, might not be so dependent. If this is true, then people living at the start of the slowly ending world could initiate a future transformation to enable later generations to find meaning without relying on further future people. In other words, the idea is that the traditions, practices, and values that we have inherited from past generations will not be fit for purpose at humanity's end. We can only pass them down at all if we simultaneously transform them so that they will be fit for purpose when the end comes. By offering the last generation the opportunity to join with earlier generations in bringing the human story to a satisfactory conclusion, my multi-generationalist solution promises to make life not just barely meaningful, but as meaningful as ever for all future people, even at humanity's end. So this solution is very ambitious. But I think this level of ambition is necessary if we're to meet the ending world anti-natalist challenge. Procreative permissibility requires not only adequate future lives, but fully meaningful ones. We cannot permissibly create future people if their lives lack some central kind of meaning. Multi-generationalism is all about intergenerational cooperation. It cannot get off the ground if procreation is no longer permissible. Multi-generationalism must meet the anti-natalist challenge. But multi-generationalism is not alone here. The anti-natalist challenge must be met by everyone else in my slowly ending world who wants to create new people and who also recognizes the importance of future dependent meaning. That is, everyone who acknowledges that unless we do something radical, the last generation will not enjoy as much meaning as those who went before. I also think there's a broader lesson here that goes beyond my thought experiment. As we saw earlier in relation to Johnson's Ponzi objection to Scheffler, eventual human extinction is inevitable. It's not something confined to my imaginary, slowly ending world. So we already need to think about our legacy to the last generation. Perhaps procreative permissibility already demands the radical transformations that multi-generationalism tries to bring about. So if it's plausible, then my multi-generationalist solution meets both the pessimist challenge and the anti-natalist challenge. But is it plausible? To answer this question, I'm going to turn finally, and you'll be pleased to hear briefly, to the challenge of reimagining utopia. My discussion of utopian thinking is the most speculative part of the book. It draws on recent work, both my own and most of the other people's, recent work on intergenerational cooperation, moral progress, and moral imagination. I don't have time to fully explore any of that today. Instead, I just want to briefly explain why utopianism matters and why it might be philosophically interesting. So I'll first explain how utopia relates to multi-generationalism. Multi-generationalism, as I've set it out, is based on intergenerational projects that reimagine future dependent traditions to make those traditions fit for purpose at humanity's end. Multi-generationalism is therefore ambitious and risky. What can motivate successive generations to launch, continue, and complete such ambitious, uncertain projects? One answer is that multi-generational projects are motivated by a new utopian vision, a model of an ideal society that both makes life fully meaningful in the very last generation and also inspires earlier generations to make that vision a reality. The obvious next question is, why would we expect utopian thinking to be inspiring in a world that's facing imminent extinction? And my reply to that challenge is that the very fact of imminent extinction enables our utopian thinking to be more ambitious rather than less. I said earlier that while my slowly ending world could be a broken future, it could also be a post-scarcity paradise. My ending world reimagining of utopian thinking picks up this post-scarcity possibility. I draw inspiration from the difficulties that confront our existing attempts to imagine a utopia that does not face imminent extinction. The problems, in other words, facing any just society that has to not just work for a generation or two, but that has to continue into an indefinite future. Many traditional philosophical utopias find it comparatively easy to develop principles and institutions that deliver justice within the present generation. They often find it harder to accommodate new generations, either because they cannot balance the freedom of present potential parents against the rights of their possible future children, or because it's difficult to reconcile a commitment to equality within each generation with a desire to enable parents to improve the life chances of their own children. So every utopian thinker struggles to accommodate procreation, child rearing, inheritance, and other intergenerational issues. If we assume that a just society has to endure indefinitely, then these difficulties just have to be solved. They have to be overcome. Obviously, any enduring utopia must permit the just creation of new people. But on the other hand, if we free ourselves to imagine one-shot, single-generation, final utopias, perfect societies that last only a single generation because they occur only at the very end of the human story, if we open ourselves to that possibility, then our utopian vision could be much more ambitious than anything that's available in a world that doesn't face imminent extinction. So in my slowly ending world, our new utopia might not be just a truncated, inadequate, unmotivating version of some previous enduring utopia. It could instead be something new and something better, precisely because it doesn't have to be built to last. In my book, I imagine, in obviously a lot more detail, I imagine single generation utopias based on existing traditions such as John Rawls's liberal egalitarianism and Robert Nozick's libertarianism, and also utopias based on rectification for historical injustice, care for non-human nature, the development of new religious movements, and on shared virtual worlds. In all of those cases, I argue that removing the need to save for future generations opens up new post-scarcity utopian possibilities. Of course, a single generation utopia is by definition not an intergenerational utopia. So it may seem that by focusing on these one generation utopias, I've just abandoned my project of multi-generationalism and intergenerational cooperation entirely. I hope that that's not the case. The solution or the explanation is that even if our utopia itself only lasts one generation, the task of establishing this future non-intergenerational utopia, that task is itself an intergenerational project. Recall that one of the central claims of my multi-generationalist solution is that this kind of radical reorientation has to take several generations. So we cannot inhabit the utopia ourselves. We're not building it for ourselves. We're laying its foundation for future people. In my slowly ending world, then, the earlier generations strive to create a just future society where they themselves would not belong. This intergenerational project hopefully makes life better than ever at the very end, as well as providing meaning to those who go before. We ourselves do not, so far as we know, live at the start of a slowly ending world, though sometimes it feels like we might. But we do inhabit a world facing an increasingly uncertain future. We too face challenges of pessimism and antinatalism, and the challenge of reimagining utopian hope. So one of the goals of my book is, one of the motivations, is the hope that we can learn how to face our own challenges by imagining people in a slowly ending world who face starker challenges, starker versions of the same challenges that we face ourselves. That's one of the reasons why I've written the book, and I hope that people will read it. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, so we have a good 40-ish minutes for Q&A now. So if you would like to ask a question, you can either just put a Q or a question in the chat, or you can use the raise hand emoji as James has done, and Andrea. And I will unmute you as we go. So James, why don't you start us off? You should be able to unmute now.
Cool, thanks. And thanks for the talk, Tim, really interesting. So I have I guess, well, just to sort of motivate my thinking, just a general question of why meaningfulness matters to begin with. And so here's maybe a thought experiment, implausible, but if you bear with me, we can imagine that this last generation lacks this central kind of meaning, right? However, this makes them extremely happy, right? They take great joy in the very fact that their life lacks this meaning. They take great joy in the fact that the meaning associated with future generations. This allows them to be maximally happy and compassionate and caring. So it seems like in this case, you would say it's impermissible to create this generation. Is that right?
Sorry, do I have to? Yeah.
Yeah, no, sorry, I had to unmute. So that's a really good question. And partly, and this is maybe not a very satisfactory answer, but partly the answer is going to depend on exactly what our principles of procreative permissibility are. And one of the goals that I've got in the book is to try and come up with a solution or an account or a way of carrying on in the slowly ending world that would make procreation permissible on as wide a range of plausible principles of procreative permissibility as possible. And one of the motivations for that is that if you're defending a multi-generationalist intergenerational project of cooperation, then you need the voluntary cooperation of the intermediate generations who continue your project and who have to then create further people after you, and you don't know what their procreative ethic is going to be, so you don't know whether they're going to feel that they're permitted to create further people down the line. And so if you aim at a final generation whose lives are in some sense meaningful, but they're completely happy, then there's a risk associated with that there could be an intermediate generation who think it's not permissible to create these people because even though their lives are really enjoyable, they're not meaningful enough, and therefore your project will fall over, or there's a risk that it will fall over. So that's one reason why I want to be able to accommodate the kind of procreative principle that says it's not enough to give people lives that are happy, they've got to be also meaningful. But an alternative approach would be one where you said, no, I'm going to push back on, I'm not going to be as broad-minded in terms of procreative permissibility. I'm going to assume that there are levels of well-being which are sufficient to outweigh meaninglessness, and that might be a plausible principle, and you might say that you're confident that you will be able to train the next generation and subsequent generations so that if the amount of happiness that's involved at the end is sufficient, then you would be justified in creating those people, or in setting in train the creation of those people. And one response I would make is to say that kind of example is useful for my multi-generationalist project as opposed to a presentist project, because I'm going to argue that creating the background, the necessary conditions for there to be a new generation of people who could find their lives sufficiently enjoyable even though they didn't have the kind of meaning that we get from the future, that's not something you can do overnight. It's not something we could do to ourselves. It's arguably not something we could do immediately to the next generation. It might require them to be in a very different kind of situation, possibly. So a couple of the utopias that I talk about, one of them is a non-human utopia where you decide that actually the best way for the future to go is for humanity to go extinct sooner rather than later, and then for us to try and rectify all the injustice that we've inflicted on the non-human natural world by having as good as possible a non-human nature that endures for the rest of the 200 years. And that would be a situation where the last sentient beings were not human beings, and so the question of whether their lives were meaningful to them might not arise, but you might still be able to make them happy enough. And another kind of utopia that I talk about is people escaping into various kinds of virtual worlds, which you can think of as virtual worlds where people are escaping from the distractions of the empirical world in order to do the most meaningful possible things. Or you could think they're virtual worlds where people are retreating from the struggles of the empirical world in order to focus on pleasure. And if they can get enough pleasure, then that might be a good enough outcome to outweigh the loss of meaning. But there's got to be something radically different. That's what the multi-generationalist is going to insist. I don't know if
it's very helpful. It's very helpful. It's adequately satisfying. Thanks.
So we have Andrea next.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I look forward very much to reading your new book. So one first question would be, when will it be published? Next year, I guess.
Yeah, so it's coming out virtually in January or February, and then so the ebook is coming out in January or February, and the hard copy is coming out in April or May, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so now the real question, the more philosophical question, let's say. So if I remember well, at least Scheffler seems to derive the fact that his scenario is particularly bad or depressing, partly because, yeah, we would find our lives less meaningful. And at least one of the reasons seems to be that we would lose something that we value. So it is including in his conception of what value is also the idea that if I value something like tradition or humanity, then this valuing itself is conceptually connected to the idea that we also care that the object of our valuing also continues to persist. So if that's the case, perhaps in your reinvention of a utopian tradition, or I forgot exactly how you call it, then it might not be sufficient to reimagine the content of what is regarded as a tradition that should change, but we should change also our, I don't know, our minds, or at least the way in which we approach the things that we value. We should rethink also the valuing, not just what is valued. And that, if you want to put it as a criticism, and that could be harder than changing the content of what we value. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, the short answer is yes. I think it is going to be harder. So the more deeply the idea of an indefinite future is embedded, not just in particular projects and not just in particular traditions and not just in particular values, but in the tradition that we have of generating new traditions, or in the very idea of what it is to value something. The more deeply embedded it is, the harder it's going to be to reimagine it, because the more is going to have to be reimagined, I suppose. And I think it may well be it's more challenging than a lot of the other kinds of reimaginings that we can think of examples of, because they're all, I mean, more or less by definition, all the actual examples are cases where something comes to an end, but there's something else that continues. So on the one hand, that's a point in favor of the multi-generationalist claim that this is going to take, if this is possible, it's going to take several generations, I suppose. So the harder it is, the less plausible it is for somebody to just say, no, look, we don't need to bother imposing this risk on future people. We'll just reimagine it now. And we'll bring everything to if it's that easy to bring everything to a close, we're going to do it immediately because we know how to do it. So one of the claims that the multi-generationalist is my solution, the person who's defending my solution is kind of walking this tightrope where they want to say, we think it's going to turn out to be possible to do this, but on the other hand, we don't already know how to do it. Because if we did know how to do it, then in some sense we could do it, right? Or at the very least, if we knew what it would look like, then we could create a next generation who would have this thing that we know what it looks like. So the idea is that we would be groping towards, or making the first steps towards, something that's enough like our tradition of valuing that it's not a complete departure from it, and which emphasizes connections between generations, but which does that in a way that's not carrying on forever, right? So the idea is that the closer we get to the end, the more people will look at their connections with past generations and think, well, we're inheriting this and we're passing it on a bit, but we're getting it ready to come to an end. And then at the end, people think we're just inheriting this and bringing it to an end, and that's a way of valuing it. I mean, one other thing you could say is you could say it doesn't have to be true that even the people at the very end are not unhappy that things are going to end. So they might be, that's got too many negatives in it. It might be true that the people at the end still wish that they could continue things on, but they think it's a pity that it has to end. In some ways, at least, it's a pity it has to end because it's a good thing. And it's part of thinking it's a good thing that you'd always want it to keep going. But on the other hand, we think this is a good place for it to end, and it's been developed in a way that ends here. But yeah, I mean, I agree. It's a challenge, and therefore it's a risk, because it might turn out that this doesn't work, and that even at the end, people either think we can't value anything anymore because we know it's all coming to an end, or we value these things, and that means we're just really depressed by the fact that they're coming to an end. But I suppose the multi-generational hope is that you could get enough sense of satisfaction that you'd brought them to a good end, that this would at least outweigh the dislocation or loss of value or whatever. But yeah, I don't know if that is persuasive or.
Thank you.
I've got a question as well, and then we can ask for another round of questions. So this is touching on something that's come up a couple of times, but I wanted to ask directly because this is the Hong Kong Catastrophic Risk Center. So I wanted to ask about applying the kind of framework you're describing to a case where it's less than 100% certain that it's going to be that we're all going to be destroyed. So, in particular, I was wondering what you might think. I mean, how likely does it have to be? Of course, there's not going to be any specific number, but how likely does it have to be before we should try to embark on this intergenerational project? Because, of course, if we do embark on the intergenerational project, and it turns out cosmic rays don't hit or whatever, there's like a near miss, then we've probably put ourselves in a very bad situation now, because we thought that there was no tomorrow and acted accordingly, and maybe set up one of these single generation utopias. So I was wondering how you think about the risk of perhaps getting it wrong and embarking on the intergenerational project when the end isn't nigh after all. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. And I touch on it a little bit in the book, but not very much. I mean, partly because, I have a character in the book who's called the escapist. And so there's someone who just says, what we should be doing is we should focus on the very, very, very vanishingly small possibility that we can escape the cosmic rays, or that we can escape extinction, and that's because the value of escaping extinction would be so astronomically high that it dominates the thinking, even if it's extremely unlikely. And one kind of sort of halfway house that the escapist at least explores is a possibility of some kind of digital utopia, right, where basically everybody uploads themselves into a computer, and then there might only be 200 years left, but the number of generations of computer life that you can pack into 200 years is enormous. So it's as if extinction was millions of years into the future. And the escapist says we should do this even if we think it's very unlikely that the digital beings will be conscious, and even if we think it's unlikely that that'll be good, because it might be good, and if it is good, it's going to be astronomically good. So I engage a little bit with those sort of astronomical value dominance arguments, but in a more realistic scenario where you say, suppose the scientists say, look, there's these cosmic rays, there's a 10% chance they're going to hit, or there's a 90% chance they're going to hit, then that is a kind of complication that I don't directly discuss in the book. So two things you could do. I mean, one kind of multi-generationalist is going to have an extreme view where they say, well, actually, an extreme non-consequentialist, non-total, especially non-total utilitarian view, where they say, well, actually, I think the possibility of imminent extinction has woken us up to the possibility of these shorter-term projects, and this would actually be better. It would be better to have a really good 200 years than to have millions of years. So we should just do it anyway. We should set things up so that they come to an end after 200 years, because that's going to be more desirable on balance than what the millions of years would be if the cosmic rays didn't hit. And so no matter how likely they are, and in fact, even if it turned out that it was just a publicity stunt from some scientists and there were no cosmic rays and it was just someone trying to short the stock market or do some kind of other thing, we'd say, oh, well, it's not going to happen, but we should embrace imminent extinction because we think that's a better way for the story to end than for it just to keep going on and on and on and on. So that would be one extreme way, which I think is probably quite extreme and not likely to appeal to that many people. I mean, the other messier way for the multi-generationalist, at least, to respond is to say, well, what we want to do, we now have this more complicated multi-generational or intergenerational project where we want to prepare the future people to be able to bring things to an end if they need to, but also to be able to carry on if carrying on is what they need to do. And that might be relatively straightforward depending on how your project ended. You might be able to leave it open-ended until until the very end. So you could have, say, if you had a virtual utopia and you said all the earlier generations are setting up the virtual utopia, which we're going to, or the digital utopia, which we're going to inaugurate at the as late as possible, because the technology will keep getting better and the social engineering and things will keep getting better. Then you could say, well, we just set up a project where people are gradually getting more and more digital or more and more virtual. And they're always ready to set things up so that the next generation is the last, but they don't have to do that until the end, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that it answers. So I don't have a definite. I mean, I definitely don't have a definite answer to how to think about the probabilities, but I do think, you know, the more we think there are plausible multi-generational projects, the less worried we might be about the prospect of imminent extinction, right? So in particular, the scenarios that I started with when I started thinking about this were these generation starship ones, where we know that the cosmic rays are going to hit, but it might be possible, or maybe we're fairly confident that it would be possible at enormous present cost to launch these starships where lots of generations of people will have a really miserable life, because it turns out living in a generation starship is actually not a lot of fun. But then, you know, so there's a present cost because the economy is going to be kind of the economy is going to be poured into building these starships, and then the early generations of people who are doing that are going to have a grim time, but then after that things are going to flourish. It does seem to me that if that's what you're balancing on one side, if that's the way of avoiding imminent extinction, then an alternative story where you embrace imminent extinction and you try and make the next 200 years really good might be more appealing, even if you knew that the starship thing was going to work. You might just think it's not worth all the future happiness or the future meaning or the whatever the future people who are going to have in the distant future. That's not worth all of this suffering, given that we've got this alternative, which promises a pretty good story that comes to an end.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's very, very helpful. We have another question from Gary O'Brien in the chat, and he asks, could you say a little bit more about what it might mean to bring the human story to a satisfying or suitable end, and how might we handle disagreement about how to end our collective story?
Yeah, no, that's a great, I mean, that is in a way, that is the big question, I guess. So I do say various things. I say various things in the book. So one thing that might count as bringing it to a satisfactory end is creating a society that is a perfect model of justice within a single generation. And you might think, if you've got a utopia that you like that would work for one generation, you might think a world where the human story is everything that leads up to the creation of that is a story that has a that has a good end. Or you might think the end is, what makes it a good end is having a last generation of people who are not traumatized by the fact that they're living at the end. I mean, that's not necessarily an answer, but it could be an answer. It could be a step towards an answer. So they might be enjoying a level of happiness or a level of comfort without worrying about the future. That would make it a good end. Alternatively, I mean, there could be religious views where you have a story that there's a certain kind of relationship with the divine or a certain kind of state that you want as many people as possible to achieve, and that would be a suitable ending. Another kind of thing that would count as a suitable ending would be spending the 200 years that are left trying to rectify historic injustices. So historic injustices to other people, or or to peoples, or to groups, or historic injustice against the natural world. Now it's going to be very, I mean, it might be hard to see how you could have a perfect rectification, but you might say we could do as much rectification as we could in 200 years, and that would be a better way for the story to end than for it to end in some other way. So the question of how we handle disagreement about how to end the story, so I guess, I mean, in a way that's a particular instance of the question, how do we handle any disagreement about how society should be organized or how we ought to do things. So there are going to be different ways of responding to that. So some of the utopias that I imagine, or actually a lot of them for various reasons to do with needing to, because they need to have intergenerational cooperation, and because the procreation needs to be permissible in every generation, and you need to be able to rely on the voluntary cooperation of all the future generations. The ideal societies that I imagine tend to be more at the sort of liberal or libertarian end. So they tend to be utopias that operate by trying as much as possible to let different groups of people have different ideas to kind of do their own thing to a certain extent. So you could say we're going to have a meta project of having as many different endings of the story as possible that people want to pursue, and so there wouldn't be a single way of bringing the human story together, but the utopia would be all the different ways that people think the end should go. I mean, that's more, it's the problem of disagreement in a way is more worrying, or is more intractable in some ways if you're in the sort of scenario that I was talking about in response to Daniel, right? So if you've got a disagreement between people who want to bring it to an end and people who don't, then that is in some ways it's harder to say, well, some people will bring it to an end and some people will not bring it to an end, because it either ends or in some sense, the human story either ends or it doesn't. But you could still say, well, these people over here are going to put all their resources, however we decide what their resources are, they're going to put all their resources into this project of trying to escape extinction. And over here, the other people are going to try and bring their part of the story to a suitable end, and some of them are going to do it like this, and some of them are going to do it like that, and so on. So hopefully, I suppose that, I mean, the short answer is hopefully that's it's no more intractable than the general problem of disagreement that you get in any intergenerational project or any story where you're trying to get people to work together, right? Except that it has this added problem that because it's cooperation across different generations, and the different generations are differently situated because some of them are closer to the end than others, there's a destabilizing possibility of disagreement between different generations, where one generation's tries to set up a long-term project, and then one of the intermediate generations says, we're not interested in that, we're just going to stop it now and have a huge party and consume everything, and so on. So the people who are starting it have to sell it to the people who come after them in such a way that the people coming after them at least agree that it's worth carrying the project on and passing it down.
Okay. Gary's Wi-Fi is unfortunately not working too well. I was satisfied by that answer, so maybe we can. Oh, he says thank you. We have time for perhaps one more question. Someone's got an additional question they'd like to ask. James, again, hold on, I'll unmute you.
Yeah, thanks. So I have a question. It's kind of about literature, I guess, but just so at one point you claim most of the principles of procreative permissibility that philosophers have defended set the following standard or imply the following claim, which is you cannot create someone whose life is barely worth living. And I was struck by this, I guess. So I know the asymmetry, but that just says you're not required, right, to create a life that's worth living. And it seems like the claim that you can't create someone whose life is barely worth living has implausible implications, I guess. I mean, it would imply that, extinction versus a world full of lives barely worth living, that we can't pick the world full of lives barely worth living. So I guess that's just an aside objection, but I guess my main question is, so I know like Benatar would accept this and critical level theorists would accept this, but I'm wondering who else accepts this claim. I might not be thinking of the right people, but this claim that you can't create someone whose life is barely worth living.
Yeah, so the particular people that I discuss in terms of the procreative ethics are Elizabeth Harman and Melinda Roberts, and so Harman's got a harm-based story about procreative ethics, and Roberts has got a person-affecting consequentialist story, and then I use Rivka Weinberg's Kantian contractualist story, and then I have my collective consequentialist story. And I guess, so to go back to one of the things I said at the beginning, at the very least, if what you want is something, if you want to be able to satisfy all of those people's procreative principles, then you need to be able to enter into voluntary cooperation with all the different generations. And I think all of those principles in different contexts will raise problems with different cases about creating people whose lives are barely worth living. And so I'm imagining someone who's kind of persuaded to some extent by all of those principles and isn't sure which one they believe and isn't sure which one the people in the next generation are going to believe. I don't know if that helps. So it's certainly true that most people, I mean, the other thing that the other strong claim that the multi-generationalist wants to make is they want to say, if the multi-generational project works, then you've got this option. So you can't, so the claim that does more of the work is not so much you can't create the person whose life is barely worth living, but you can't create the person whose life is, so it's not so much you can't create a person whose life is barely worth living, it's you can't create a person whose life is barely worth living if one of your other alternatives was to create somebody else whose life was much more meaningful. So it's more that different people comparison that does a lot of the work. I don't know if that.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's helpful. Also, I apologize. I didn't mean to like put you on the spot to like name names, but I did write them down. I was interested genuinely in like who exactly was. So thanks. That's really helpful.
No, it's good. For
Okay.
me to have to remember
that's all we have time
who
for.
it was.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
That's all we have time for. So please join me in thanking our speaker one last time. And particularly because for Professor Mulgan, this has been from 9:30 p.m. to 11 instead of 4:30 p.m. to 6 like it is for us in Hong Kong. So greatly appreciate it. And greatly appreciate the turnout we had here today. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, everyone, for the questions. That was really helpful for me. Thank you.
Have a good evening.